When you have iron plus ROS, right, and lipid peroxidation all happening, first in the liver will stop producing the appropriate amount of, or it won't react appropriately to glucose. So you start getting the onset of insulin resistance happening at the liver side, basically just because you have broken liver cells in which the liver's not responding appropriately to basically keeping our glucose balanced. At the same time, once iron deposition and this whole process starts happening in our pancreas, our beta cells stop producing insulin. So we've got kind of a 1-2 hit of both our pancreas and liver. And when you combine those, that then sets you up for metabolic syndrome, right? Which is this high insulin or insulin resistance, high glucose. You get this middle, adiposity, weight gain. And then that all sets you up for an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes.
Dr. Stephanie Venn-Watson, I had you on earlier this year, but there's this brand new study that just came out. So it was absolutely worth bringing you right back on to talk about this. So without further ado, let's just jump right into this because I'm going to let you explain the science. I'll ask some questions because this is one of the coolest studies that I've seen this year.
Great. Well, thanks, Thomas. Well, so we discovered the first nutritional deficiency syndrome in over 75 years. So you think about things like vitamin C and scurvy and vitamin D deficiency and rickets. We've discovered a deficiency syndrome thanks to C15 deficiencies, and it's called cellular fragility syndrome. And so it's a giant discovery. And what's so wonderful about discovering a nutritional deficiency, even though, it sounds devastating, is that this is something we can detect, Thomas, and something we can fix. So excited to be able to be here to talk about this discovery and, what it means for all of us.
What exactly is cellular fragility?
So when we talk about, our bodies are made out of cells. So every part of us is made out of cells, and our cells are armored by these cell membranes. And so the cell membranes are made out of lipids, and they can become weak. And what we've learned is that based upon the type of fatty acids in the cell membrane dictates how strong or weak our cells' membranes are. And why do we care about that? Well, it's because when our cells become weak, they undergo faster aging. So basically, they fall apart a lot faster. They age faster. That translates to us aging faster. And so what's so important about this discovery is we've learned that over the past 12 years of research, not just us, but others around the world, that if we don't have a certain level of C15 in our cell membrane, this sturdy saturated fatty acid in our cell membranes become weak. We age faster than we should. And we now think it may explain the onset of these aging-associated diseases, things like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart disease, are increasing in younger and younger people. And now we think that the C15 deficiency syndrome, cellular fragility syndrome, may be the cause of why younger and younger people are getting older diseases.
Is it just because the cell becomes more like penetrable to like all these different things? Like how does that really work? How does a fragile cell membrane impact, say, like insulin resistance, things like that? Like, where's the interplay there?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating story, and it goes back to 2012. So back in 2012, there was a group of scientists at Columbia University, and they published this paper in which they discovered an entirely new way that our cells were dying, and it's called ferroptosis or ferroptosis. We just say, if you're in England, it's ferroptosis. It's yours for, I'm not quite sure which way is the right way. But the key point being that these researchers discovered an entirely new way our cells were dying. Prior to this discovery, there were only 3 known ways that our cells could die, called apoptosis, necrosis, and autophagy. And this was just like you go to cell biology class, at your university, 3 ways our cells die, great. They discovered a 4th. And what was really interesting about it is that they discovered that there was a really unique way that our cells were starting to die. And it started with literally the way they explain it is that there's fragile fatty acids in the cell membrane that then results in lipid peroxidation. So lipid peroxidation is when you have fragile fats, they then go bad. So they get exposed to oxygen, attacked by oxygen, they get lipid peroxidation. So now you have that. And then for some strange reason, iron is showing up inside of these cells. And when you combine lipid peroxidation with iron, that results in massive production of these things called reactive oxygen species, or ROS. The ROS then go and kill our mitochondria. And as we all know, right from our third grade classes, mitochondria is the powerhouse of our cells. That knocks out our mitochondria.
Where'd you go to school? Because I learned that like 10th grade. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm a nerd. so yeah. I know you and Eric just worked out, and I stood on the sidelines. So that the nerd part was the mitochondria. So powerhouses of our cells. So basically then knocks out the batteries, the energy producers of our cells. So when these scientists were looking under the microscope at Columbia University, Thomas, they were seeing intact cells with kind of strange looking cell membranes, and all the mitochondria were killed. And so they said, this cell is dead. What is happening? That was discovered in 2012. Since then, over 10,000 papers have been published on ferroptosis from around the world. Nobody has understood, despite all that science, nobody has understood what causes ferroptosis. Why did it show up on our doorstep, right, about a dozen years ago, and until now. So now what we're finding is that C15 deficiency, what this paper that we just published showed, that C15 deficiency is causing the beginning, the middle, and the end of ferroptosis. Most importantly, we've been able to show that putting C15 back into our bodies fixes it all. So really exciting times.
So with this study in particular, like how was it laid out? How did you discover this deficiency specifically with regard to this paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really a culmination of the 12 years of studies. So the same year, 2012, when ferroptosis was discovered by Columbia University, which, to be honest, I didn't know about for many, many years. At the same year that paper was published, we published a paper describing the strange disease that was popping up in the Navy's dolphins and dolphins in the wild as well. But increasingly, there was this liver disease that was popping up in Navy dolphins, and they had iron overload in their livers, and they were getting fatty liver disease and insulin resistance and things that older dolphins would get, but we were starting to see it in younger dolphins. So we were diving in to basically figure out what was happening with the dolphins, what was causing it. That's when we did advanced technology called metabolomics. We looked at thousands of small molecules in their fish diet and in their bodies to figure out which small molecules predicted this syndrome that we were seeing. And that's where C15 was one of the top predictors of dolphins who weren't getting this disease. So that headed us down this pathway of taking C15 into the lab. We were then able to show in the lab that C15 helps to fix all components of ferroptosis. It stabilizes cell membranes by greater than 80%. So it stops it right at the top of the problem. It decreases lipid peroxidation. It stops iron deposition. So we'll talk a little more about that, which is another obviously key parts of ferroptosis, the ferro being iron. It stops the deposition of the iron. It decreases the amount of reactive oxygen species in the cell, and it repaired mitochondria. So that whole series of studies we published back in 2020 in the paper in Scientific Reports. And so really what's been happening since 2020 is it's been understanding more and more of what's been happening in people that has overlapped with what's happening in dolphins, and us understanding, oh my gosh, it's a decrease in C15 globally that's happening in the dolphins. It's because the types of fish they were eating have less and less C15 in it. As our waters are getting warmer, unfortunately, our fish are getting less fat. There's actually a study that just came out in Science showing that the world's fish are getting smaller because the waters are warmer. So they have less fat, less C15 to the dolphins. For us, we have less C15 globally. We've been doing so for over 50 years by taking C15 out of our diets because our primary source of C15 is dairy fat. So we had this concurrent, coincidental decrease in C15 in diets happening in dolphins and humans. The result, however, was the same, which was ferroptosis. because of C15 deficiencies.
That's so wild. So
That's crazy.
What I do know about ferroptosis, I mean, a lot of it is it's iron deposition in the liver specifically. There's one of the big components of it, right?
That's right.
So is that just sending like a cascade of high levels of ROS directly from the liver, epicentered out of the liver and kind of radiating out from there? Or is it just concentrated in the liver, or is ferroptosis occurring independent of the liver? Is it not just happening there? I mean, and you may or may not know this, but what's actually causing the iron to just deposit there? Like, why is it flocking to the liver, and why is it just because it's trying to get metabolized? I don't know. I have questions there.
Yeah, those are all great questions. So, and that's what's been kind of hanging out there. It's like, how is this all happening, right? And so it's almost like science has gotten stuck in the weeds of looking at specific genes and little triggers inside the cell. Meanwhile, we had this like real life patient population that was getting this syndrome, the dolphins, and we were really able to understand exactly cleanly how this goes down. So what we now understand is what's called the pathophysiology. So the whole thing of how C15 deficiencies lead to this entire syndrome. And it all starts with when we have low C15 in our cells. That includes our red blood cells. So let's start with our red blood cells. So then those red blood cells become weak. Now, our body has a really good way of detecting weak red blood cells and saying, you shouldn't be in the system anymore. We're going to take you out. So you have these cells in the liver called macrophages, and their job is to basically engulf and eat all the weak red blood cells that we have in our body, which normally is a good thing. But what happens when we have a lot of weak red blood cells, because we have too little C15 in those cells, the macrophages eat them, and the corpses of the red blood cells that are left behind,
iron. Have iron, yep.
Yeah. So what happens is then it accumulates over time. Our bodies are still able to make these red blood cells, so they get taken out of the system. We make more. So, when you don't necessarily have anemia in the early stages, but there is a measurement called red blood cell distribution width, or RDW. And it's one of the first things we saw in the dolphins, which just means that your red blood cell sizes there's a lot of variation. There's some big ones, some little ones. It just means that your body's working, you're losing red blood cells, you're making them, and you just have this mix of sizes. So it's one of the first hints of something is going wrong. And RDW is actually a predictor of longevity in people. So we can get back to the whole longevity conversation. So it's a fascinating metric that's gained a lot of traction. So again, we think it's all tied to this ferroptosis. So the red blood cells become weak. The iron or the liver engulfs them. You now have iron deposition in the liver. You now have an angry liver. So now we're talking about a liver that's getting increased iron, and along with these fragile cells in the liver as well. So you have lipid peroxidation, iron ferroptosis has now kicked in the liver. So then what happens is the next signal and sign are elevated liver enzymes. So the liver's now saying, hey, I'm getting a little bit angry here because my cells are getting injured. And that's one of the first signals they throw off. From there, then, just like you were kind of getting to, right, is that what happens is when you get enough iron overload in the liver, you get a spillover effect. You have increased ROS. You have increased lipid peroxidation. You have increased iron. That iron, lipid peroxidation, and reactive oxygen species spill over into the blood, and now they start seeding our whole bodies. So it goes through these different stages, and that's where now there's tons of papers talking about iron deposition in the brain, in the heart, in the pancreas, and those are drivers for Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, in addition to the initial liver disease. So that's how we clearly understand it all happens. We've been able to show that C15 reverses this entire process, and it starts at the very beginning. We just need to have stronger cells that stops this whole process from kicking off.
It's like the Roman Empire, like starting in Rome, the liver, and like creating these little depots everywhere else that then from there like cause problems there, in the heart and the brain and whatnot. Because it's like it sounds like everywhere you have a potential iron deposition, you have like another factory for ROS, right? You have another because it's like the more oxidation that happens there, the more it's going to be exacerbated in that area.
That's right.
And how does that particularly, like with the ROS and the iron depositions, how does that relate to metabolic disease or metabolic dysfunction, like specifically with like insulin resistance, like how does a high level of ROS or a high level of iron deposited somewhere impact insulin resistance? Because I think for most people, that's a hard thing to bridge, right? It's like, okay, we've got ROS, but how does that impact glucose and that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we now understand, we now know that when you have iron plus ROS, right, and lipid peroxidation all happening, first in the liver will stop producing the appropriate amount of, or it won't react appropriately to glucose. So you start getting the onset of insulin resistance happening at the liver side, basically just because you have broken liver cells in which the liver's not responding appropriately to basically keeping our glucose balanced. At the same time, once iron deposition and this whole process starts happening in our pancreas, our beta cells stop producing insulin. So we've got kind of a 1-2 hit of both our pancreas and liver. And when you combine those, that then sets you up for metabolic syndrome, right? Which is this high insulin or insulin resistance, high glucose. You get this middle, adiposity, weight gain. And then that all sets you up for an increased risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. Where we caught the dolphins was right at that stage of basically metabolic syndrome before it had advanced to these advanced, conditions. So it was really at the perfect spot to understand the pathophysiology leading to that.
Wow. So does a C15 deficiency, are you starting to see direct links? Maybe not necessarily, like right now it's easy to say there's a potential indirect link because you've got the metabolic piece and that could affect cardiometabolic and cardiovascular disease and whatnot. Are there any signs that there's direct links with C15 deficiency and ferroptosis and cardiovascular disease, like independent of the metabolic side?
Yeah, there is. So with regard to, the dolphins were an interesting and again, a clean model in which because they weren't getting enough C15 in their diet because the fish had less C15, that we were able to see this. We were able then to repeat this in the lab. So to be able to show directly that there are models of ferroptosis that then we could show that C15 could fix it. So we've got, the side that the dolphins are indicating C15 deficiencies cause it, able to show in a model that C15 fixes it. So then we start moving to the human data, right? And this is where we see, where we explain in the paper, which is a beast of a paper. So if you're trying to sleep, that could help you sleep just by trying to get through this paper. So, but what it works through this logical arguments with regard to, okay, what is ferroptosis known to do? It is known to increase our risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver disease. It's really what we focus on. Not only does it increase the risk of it, but it speeds up the onset of these diseases and it makes it more aggressive. So if we talk about younger people, so people with younger kids, people less than 20 years old, getting type 2 diabetes, right? So type 2 diabetes used to be an adult onset disease, and we used to call type 1 diabetes juvenile onset. Remember that?
Yep.
Okay, so at some point in time, about when all of this started happening, children started getting type 2 diabetes. And not only that, but they're more aggressive than the type 2 diabetes that we're used to seeing. They have a higher risk rate and of complications than even kids with type 1 diabetes, which that in itself is a devastating disease. So ferroptosis in this process is showing up in younger people. It's explaining how they're getting more aggressive diseases faster. People between 18 to 44 years old, increasingly getting coronary heart disease. I mean, we were on an amazing trajectory of decreasing heart disease for decades. Still is the same case for people over 50. So I'm in the clear, but for younger people, the increased risk of heart disease has been going way up. When I get back to type 2 diabetes, 673% increase is expected in young people by the year 2030 in type 2 diabetes. So it's really, and then we talk about fatty liver disease, right? This is a disease that didn't exist before a paper was published by the Mayo Clinic in 1980. They found the first 20 patients with fatty liver disease that wasn't associated with alcohol, right? Prior, you see this disease, it was always associated with alcohol consumption, which is why they called it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So Mayo Clinic publishes this, first 20 cases in 1980. Today, it's now impacting 1 in 3 people globally and 1 in 10 children. So there's been this big mystery of how is it happening. We're all understanding that ferroptosis is driving this process and this speed up of the problem. And now it's being able to say, okay, the study's now showing people with higher C15 levels, lower risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and fatty liver disease. And this isn't just one study or two study. These are a meta-analyses of thousands of people over decades of time, consistently showing how much basically C15 we need in order to protect against getting these diseases.
I mean, it's almost like we've been looking at so many things in isolation, which we should, but at the same time, I mean, it sounds like it's accelerated aging is like really what's happening. It's like we're just finding that like people at a younger age are experiencing problems that shouldn't be an issue maybe at all, but are, previously an issue when they're over 50, 60 years old. And it's like everything's just accelerating. So it's like, okay, here we are looking at these sole things, okay, like cardiovascular disease or diabetes, but we're not looking at, dare I say, the root. I hate when people say the root because it sounds kind of cheesy, but it's like, okay, like the root really seems like, okay, we're just moving through this so fast. And I'm kind of thinking, again, like an iron deposition and reactive oxygen species, it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's like you've got an iron deposition. I know we've talked about this before, but like you leave, a bunch of anvils or a bunch of dumbbells out in the elements, right? It's like, okay, if you had a little bit of oxygen, they would rust and they would, have a problem. A little bit of the elements, they would have a problem. But as the weather gets worse, it oxidize even more, right? So it's like, okay, sure, the iron deposition as a result of this deficiency is problematic, but then you combine that with the crappy lifestyle, and it's like almost literally throwing gasoline on this fire, right? It's just gonna take off from there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, examples include, as far as, when you talk to pediatricians these days, and especially like we work with Dr. Jeff Schwimmer, he's one of the leaders in pediatric fatty liver disease. And, we talked about it and we brought up this idea of like accelerated aging in kids. And like, I didn't even get to finish the sentence. He's like, oh no, this is absolutely what's happening. Like kids are getting the diseases of their grandparents before their parents get them. He's like, it's unquestionable. There's accelerated aging happening in these kids. It's not only impacting their kind of like you see them getting high blood pressure and high cholesterol. I mean, it's just, and he goes, and there are, mental health problems that are coming with it. It's, there's just this giant, ball of twine that is just like that they're getting caught up in. So there isn't, C15 is not like, oh, and that's it. And that's the only problem. And that, but a lot of it, as far as, when we look back and you look back at what is causing this, why are younger people getting these diseases? A lot of people fall back on obesity. Well, it's like, well, kids are more obese and this is what happens with obesity. And it's a pretty simple problem. They also talk about trans fats or there's too much ultra processed foods. And those are all likely contributors to the problem. But for us, it's like we go back to the dolphins. Yeah. And the dolphins aren't obese. They aren't getting, ultra processed foods and they're not eating a bunch of trans fatty acids. So for them, they again provided this amazingly clean picture of they decreased their amount of C15. We can now quantify how much C15 needs to be in those cells. It's 0.2% of fatty acids in our cell membrane. We need at least that for that cell membrane to stay intact. You have less C15 than that, and that is now what we're defining as nutritional deficiency syndrome, or now it makes a lot of sense, cellular fragility syndrome. So the good thing is we can now measure and detect how much is in there, and then, detect who has the deficiencies, and most importantly, how to fix it. How can we get our world back to where we could have these healthy cells that are meant to keep us alive and long and healthy for a long, long period of time.
I don't know if listeners understand the magnitude, because it took me a long time to like understand the magnitude of like what a true clinical deficiency is. Like we haven't had a clinical deficiency that we could say is a legit clinical deficiency. Like people say, oh, I'm deficient in vitamin B because I'm vegan or whatever. Like It's not a clinical deficiency. Like, first of all, like a lot of the deficiencies we talk about is guesswork. It's not, we can assume or we can get a micronutrient panel and see that we're moderately deficient in something, but a clinical deficiency, like a real deficiency, that's big news. And that's, why this paper is the real deal, to actually demonstrate that we're seeing widespread, like this is a legit deficiency, just like vitamin C deficiency causes scurvy, and just like the real deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's what was critical for this paper was to be able to define the pathophysiology of it. So you can't just say, oh, this is a normal, bell curve for C15 levels in people, and if you have the low level, you're deficient, right? It's like, no. Yeah. It's a nutritional deficiency requires, one, that the thing that you're calling deficient, that nutrient has to be essential. So it means that we have to get certain amounts. Our body has to have certain amounts of it in order to just maintain baseline health. And in the absence of it, we fall apart. Right. And that's very, very rare. So we're talking about our vitamins, right? So vitamin C, vitamin D. And then the second part is that not only proof that if levels are low, you develop a disease because of those levels, but when you restore that nutrient back into the system, that then that specific deficiency syndrome is fixed. And so that's what this paper goes in incredible detail. It has 150 or 142 references.
I've been up for 6 days reading.
Let's get your highlighter out. But so it's that it goes into detail of basically checking off all of those boxes where it is well defined. It is shown that it's caused by deficiencies in C15. It is fixed by C15. It's very definable. And all of this showed up. Ferroptosis, this accelerated aging, all of it showed up at the same time we've been taking C15 out of our diets. So this, experiment that we've done over the last 50 years unintentionally for bad reasons, has, by taking C15 out of our diets, we've basically, tested the hypothesis of, is C15 really an essential fatty acid, which is what we discovered, back in 2020.
I want to talk about Sardinia for a second, because Sardinia is very interesting anyway from a longevity perspective. I've done pretty detailed videos on just multiple aspects. I mean, ranging from like the grapes grown at high altitude for the specific wine, the mastic oil, even mastic gum, like other components of their diet, like a lot of dairy from sheep, a lot of like very interesting diet. And in isolation, like Sardinia is one of the most unique blue zones to begin with. Like it has its own outlying aspects of it that are different from the other blue zones independently. And I don't want to, go off on my own high horse about it, but it's just so interesting. Like, protein consumption is a little bit higher in Sardinia than a lot of the other ones. And you mentioned something before we were filming about Sardinia that I didn't know, and that was about a specific kind of cheese that they eat there. And I want to kind of double down on that because that's really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sardinia is fascinating. You're correct. Very fascinating. With regard to, it's one of the 5 longevity blue zones, as you mentioned, Thomas. And so with Sardinia, the other thing that's unique about it, because it's called the island of centenarians, right, where people are most likely to live to 100 years old, and specifically men. So this actually has the largest population or relative population of long-lived centenarian men of anywhere in the world, even
because
including
normally women live longer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like, so something, you're right, that something is very unique of what's happening in Sardinia. So as we were going through the papers and working through, okay, what are normal levels of C15? Because what we do in the paper is we help define nutritional deficiency, what's low, what's normal, and now what may be optimal C15 levels. So we have the opportunity here to maybe not just get back to where we were, to the healthy levels where our cells keep us healthy the way nature intended for maybe most of us, but Sardinia is providing a clue that there may be a way that if we push C15 levels even higher, we can actually help support longevity. And so with Sardinia, they have levels, so on average, the average person today has C15 levels in their cell membranes of 0.2% of total fatty acids. which is right that breaking point where it's like you may or may not get disease whether you're on either side of that 0.2%. In Sardinia, even as you look at the older people, and our C15 levels naturally decline as we get older, right? So we're talking 0.2% in your average aged population. So in Sardinia, they looked at 60 to 75-year-olds, and they have C15 levels of 0.64. So more than three times higher C15 levels. We're like, what? And so this paper came out from Menk et al. Showing, and where they called out, hey, people in Sardinia have very high C15 levels. And so when we looked into that, and then even when they get to 80 to 100, it does go down as they age. But even the 80 to 100 plusers still have 0.4%. And when they compared that to low longevity zone, I shouldn't even put it in quotes, to a low longevity zone, the low longevity zone had 0.2%. So basically the world is in a low longevity zone C15 level. So when we get back to Sardinia, it's like, okay, well, how are they getting C15 levels so high? There's a whole lot of hope here, right? So it's like, how are they doing it? So when we looked at Sardinia and just basically all the papers, tons of papers published on Sardinia, we found that they, just like you had mentioned, first, all the food that they eat comes from what they make. So it's local. And they have primarily replaced meat with dairy. So meat is only eaten maybe once a week on Sundays and special occasions. Otherwise, they've basically replaced where most people eat meat with dairy. The dairy, can be up to 25% of the caloric intake is dairy. I'm not recommending that for just in general, but remarkable, right? Yeah. So where we hit the sweet spot is the type of dairy they're eating. So they are goat and sheep herders, as you had mentioned. It is in a mountainous region of the island of Sardinia, and the goats and the sheep are grazing on mountainous grass. Now, other studies have shown that not only do grass-fed animals produce milk with higher C15. So if you take a cow and you feed it grass, just any type of grass, it will have twice as much C15 in its milk than a cow that is fed 100% corn. So there's already a huge differentiation there. So we know that eating the grass. There are other studies show that not only is eating grass going to help, but the higher the altitude the grass, the higher the C15 in their milk. So now you've got mountainous grass eating local goats and sheep creating this milk that is very high in C15. So like double the amount of C15 as other animals. And we know why, right? They're eating mountainous grass. Closer
to the sun, perhaps? Maybe like something happening in the grass there?
It very well could be. I mean, the same thing was repeated in the Alps. So there was a separate study done in the Alps, and they showed that the Alp grass had led to higher C15 in milk in cows that were grazing in alpine grass versus others. So, this is actionable, right? So this is something that can be done, not necessarily industry-wide, but there shows that there's hope for us to be able to get higher C15 back into our dairy. So when we look at the cheeses they eat pecorino cheese, which is a hard sheep cheese, and pecorino cheese has C15 levels that are twice as much as even cow's butter, which was previously seen as like the high C15 one. So pecorino cheese, great. They have another type of cheese that they eat that's like a soft goat cheese that they age for 30 days. And what studies showed is that the C15 in those, or the fatty acids in that cheese, are actually free fatty acids. So there's over that aging period, the fatty acids go from these complex lipids to these like easy and bioavailable free fatty acids. So now not only do you have higher C15, it's now more bioavailable because it's a free fatty acid. So then you add those together, and it's like that's how they're getting high C15 and associated with lower heart disease. So people in Sardinia live longer because they're less likely to die of heart disease, which is why men are living longer. And now numerous studies showing that people with higher C15, especially between 0.4 to 0.55%, lower risk of getting heart disease. So, everything starts coming together with regard to Sardinia. Is giving us a lot of hope that can we repeat that, model globally.
I know there is some literature over a decade ago too on like high altitude cows in Switzerland and the cheese having higher levels of conjugated linoleic acid as well, which is again another really important compound. When you look at and just to clarify, like C15, this is an essential fat that the body can't create it, so it has to come from the diet.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's because I know obviously there's certain compounds in the body where it's like, well, maybe we could dig a little deeper and understand why we're not producing enough of it, yada, yada. But this isn't the case. This is purely something we would get from the diet.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there is, our body has some production of C15. Some of it can come from when we eat fiber. That fiber contains inulin. Inulin feeds microbes in our gut, and those microbes can use inulin to make C15. So there's some production. It's still coming from the diet because we're eating the fiber, and that that can create some C15. The big thing with regard to the essential fatty acid that you're talking about, Thomas, is that do we make enough C15 to be able to support the long-term health? And what it appears to be is that we can get enough. Our bodies can do enough to get to, or whatever we're eating, whatever it is that we're eating, gets us successfully to this 0.2%. But we need to get above that. And it's not that much more. It's just like we just have to get out of this danger zone and get into the safe zone of having our cells stable enough. It appears to be very clear that we have to have some amount of C15 in our diet to be able to achieve those levels, and hence the essentiality. Yeah,
I mean, it's not realistic. I mean, as much as I would love to pack up and move to Sardinia, I probably wouldn't complain. Like, it's not realistic for us to get 25% of our calories from dairy. That's just unrealistic. So it's, when you look at, okay, sure, these populations, they've got it going on. Like, I mean, I know from the case of Sardinia, like happiness scores with men are significantly higher. I know like the men have, I can't remember it's a specific term for it, but the men have more dedicated like social time. Whereas like in other regions, men are a little bit more isolated, also focused on work and things like that. There's a lifestyle component that allows men a little bit more of this like social aspect that seems higher than in other regions. So there's a happiness score with the men. So that might add into that. I mean, the whole lifestyle with Sardinia is amazing. Obviously the mineral profile they get from the shellfish, it's, you talk about death by 1,000 cuts. In this case, it's like the other, right? It's like, like, okay, they've just got, it's in isolation, so many things going for them. And then you look at, okay, well, if we even tried to engineer that into our lives in the United States. First of all, I don't think that it would be the same equation with bovine milk. So you go to the US and it's like, I mean, I don't know the statistic. If I had to guess, it's probably more than 98% is consumption of bovine milk versus goat milk. Most people I talk to don't even like goat. I love goat milk, but goat milk and goat cheese, most people just want. So it's like, okay, already you're at a lower amount of C15 to begin with. Not to mention, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but there's probably less pasteurization and stuff occurring like in Sardinia, like probably more raw milk consumption. Right. Mm-hmm. And, that's only allowed in 8 states in the United States to even have raw milk in the first place. So who knows? You might know. I mean, if pasteurization breaks down some of the C15, I don't know. Yeah. It's the bottom line is like, it's probably unrealistic to get adequate amounts of C15 from the diet, via dairy in the United States. Yeah,
I think, Thomas, it's a good point. Like, we used to. I mean, because it seems like we used to get enough. And because the point is, over what's been happening, this accelerated aging, the increase in type 2 diabetes and heart disease and, fatty liver disease showing up, something is worse now than it was before, like prior 1990. And, 1977 is when Congress released recommendations saying, hey, all saturated fats are bad for you. Specifically, stop drinking whole fat milk and stop eating butter, and that will save your hearts. That ended up being partly true and partly devastating, right? So in that whole dairy fat, it contains that from cows has one or less than 1% C15 of all the fats. It has more than 40% pro-inflammatory saturated fats. So C15, even in dairy fat, especially the ones that we're talking about, not in Sardinia, are kind of having to go an uphill battle with regard to C15 be able to do its good job battling against, much higher levels of these pro-inflammatory fats. Other studies have shown that the higher fat we eat with C15 in it, the less likely our C15 levels will actually go down. And that is because when we go to absorb all those fats at the same time in the food, C15 loses. And so we have a higher tendency to absorb these pro-inflammatory fats versus C15. So there are a lot of things that kind of put dairy at odds. There's hope because it's worse than it was. So then the question is, can we get to Sardinian level, which is your challenge, right?
Personally, your challenge?
Well, can I get challenge globally?
Challenge accepted. No.
All right, good deal. Let's go have some pecorino. Can we get to Sardinia even if we were at 1950s, U.S.? Probably not, because of all these other challenges. The last part to put in with regard to dairy is that there was a group of panelists, and so these were experts in dairy fat and in nutrition. They met in Europe back in 2017, and they asked this question, which is, okay, whole dairy fat or individual ingredients within dairy fat? Is there really a difference? Because we're always taught that whole food is better, and in most cases, this is absolutely true. What they concluded is that dairy fat, because there are over 400 fatty acids, there's just a lot happening in dairy fat. We were talking about how much variation there can be in dairy fat, that thousands of studies being done on dairy fat conclude that it does not reliably improve our metabolic, heart, and liver health. There are studies that show that it does. There are just as many studies showing that it doesn't. So their conclusion was you can't just eat more dairy fat to get these individual nutrients to support your metabolic, heart, and liver health. What they did conclude is that individual nutrients within dairy fat can have a beneficial effect, but they have to be taken out of that milieu, what they call the matrix, in order to be able to have their effect. And this sounds like a spin, but it's, this is a group that has no bias. And what their conclusion is, there are just times in which we can use nature to find a nutrient that can really shine when it doesn't need to compete, especially with these changes in agriculture that we have less and less control over. So that was a really long answer.
No, but it's, and part of me thinks too is like, okay, the Sardinians also eat in a pretty consistent deficit all the time, right? So it's like, you can't deny the literature that supports heavy saturated fat consumption being problematic, specifically in a surplus, right?
Yeah,
that's
it.
I haven't seen a lot of data to support, I just don't think the cohort really exists to be like, hey, let's look at people that consume high amounts of saturated fat, but they're also in a deficit. That pretty much doesn't exist in America. If you're eating saturated fat, you are probably in the category, high amounts of saturated fat. You're not doing a carnivore diet. You're not doing this. You're probably in the category of people that are getting saturated fat from fried foods and things like that. So it's just the cohort doesn't exist. We can't look at that. So it's like you look at Sardinia, it's like, sure, their saturated fat consumption as a percentage of their diet is probably astronomically high, but they're also living in a probably consistent 10 to 15% deficit, and they're probably having all these other factors that are positively compounding that, right? So at the saturated fat, there's less, it's granted a little bit of amnesty because it's overridden by all this other positive stuff. You apply that to the US, if you were to tell people in the US, it's almost dangerous. It would almost be irresponsible to say, hey, United States as a whole, people that don't have nutrition education, you need to eat more cheese. Because the first thing they're going to probably do is go to, does Arby's have cheese? I don't know, but they're going to go and ask for more queso, right? It's different. It's different. I understand the issue there. I know that C15, just like other some other things, you can get in supplement form. You guys do a great job with Fatty 15 and C15 there, and I'll link out to that down below. But it sounds like that's really the way to go for specific C15 in isolation.
Yeah, I think there are multiple things we need to do, right? And so because now that there really is a true nutritional deficiency syndrome, we need to fix it. So if you find out that scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, you don't come up with other ways other than like, well, let's start with getting vitamin C,
Yeah.
back. And so
Yeah.
same thing here. And so there are multiple ways to be able to bring C15 back into our lives. Eric, my Navy physician husband and I, this was all discovered when we were working at the Navy, as, myself as a civil servant and, Eric as active duty. So, as we were doing the science and the studies, what became apparent to us is that, and working in cooperation with the Navy, is that we had an opportunity for a pure C15 ingredient to be able to be more potent, bioavailable, vegan friendly, to help with this problem. So it wasn't to create a market, right?
Yeah.
It's like, unfortunately, the dolphins were showing there's a need, and the military way is that if you have a problem, research is invested on how to fix it, which is why all of this work was.
How about that?
So it's like, I know this sounds crazy, but it's like Office of Naval Research funded this work, and it was specifically to say, hey, we've identified the syndrome in dolphins. Here's the money to do the research to figure out what the problem is and to fix it. And you have X number of years. It is not like you spend your career working on little intricacies of it and publishing papers. It is
It's a problem that you solve.
go fix it.
Yeah.
And so, which we did. And we did it in, for the dolphins, we did it in about 4 years' time, because that's what you do with the military.
Yeah.
So this whole thing was born from saying, hey, we see a problem. It started with Navy dolphins, right? And then now that extended to now global health. And so it's a problem. And so one way to fix it, one part of the solution is to have a pure ingredient that basically helps take over or puts aside these other barriers, of having to compete with pro-inflammatory saturated fats. Let it be vegan friendly. Have it well controlled so that it is more than 99.8% pure at the exact amounts we need. We now know that the average person needs between 100 to 2 milligrams at least of pure bioavailable C15 per day. So that is what the dose of fatty 15 was. So this was all driven by a decade of science before we even thought of bringing, this ingredient to the market. So we do feel strongly that this ingredient will play an important role with regard to not just as a supplement, but fortifying foods. How do we increase accessibility to C15 globally? Because this problem is not just in the US, it's everywhere, mostly in developed countries, because we've created this problem. And on top of that, okay, what can we learn from Sardinia? Okay, so maybe, cows, we should be feeding them more grass. Let's put pressure on the industry to be able to report how much C15 is in your product, so that when consumers go to the store, they can look at the different dairy products and say, if I'm going to choose butter A or butter B, I'm going to choose the one that has higher C15 in it. So I think there are ways we can move forward. Another one is with kids. Pediatricians in the 1990s really made this movement of saying, we went from all Americans should avoid eating drinking whole fat dairy and eating butter. And that was 1977 through 1990. Then around 1990, 1991, the pediatric community came in, again, all with good intentions. But they then said, okay, young children, infants, and toddlers should not get whole fat milk. And it was pretty bold at the time. So we went from, before 1990, a 12-month-old child, 90% of them will have had whole fat milk by the time they're 1. Today, it's less than 10% of children have been exposed to whole fat cow's milk. Wow. So it's been a dramatic, so now we're talking about the youngest of young not getting adequate C15 levels, even from mom's milk, because if mom is C15 deficient, she has less C15 in her milk. So we're talking about deficiencies that are starting at birth, which is why we're seeing this translating to these are now people turning 30 years old.
Yeah, I mean, when you have massive cell differentiation that's occurring at that age, and it's who knows, even epigenetically, who knows what that's doing for them, how it's setting them up for or not setting them up for success as they get older, right? It's like when it's such a pivotal time.
Yeah, there's a study that just came out. In fact, it's a preprint right now that showed in which it's a big study done in France, and they follow moms from pregnancy and then through baby being born through the children developing. And right now they have the kids up to, I think, about 11 years old, and some of the oldest ones in the cohort. And what the preprint shows is that moms who had less C15 in their red blood cell membrane during pregnancy and in their milk resulted in kids, if they had lower C15, the kids don't perform as well as 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 5 and 6-year-olds cognitively. So it's just, like you're saying, what does this mean from a developmental level? And so that it's not like, oh, therefore all infants should get fatty 15, right? This is like, how about, why don't we start by getting whole fat milk safely, back into, into our youngest of young. And, things like infant formulas have no C15 in them, none. And so separate papers, made a call to action saying we should be putting C15, fortifying C15 in infant formulas because it's becoming clearer and clearer. This is an essential nutrient we need. So there's a lot of things to be done. We think, fatty 15 and supplements part of the solution, but we're really working with the whole community, global community, to fix, a big problem. The upside is there's so much hope because there's a solution.
I mean, it's there. Like I have mixed feelings on like fortification of foods, but at the same time, it's like this is something where, I mean, is that in your crosshairs at all? Like just being like, okay, we've got like good, dairy product. Like, okay, we fortify with vitamin D because we saw that as an issue.
Yeah.
Like, is it in your crosshairs to say like, hey, like we can, or where's your stance on fortification with C15?
Yeah, I think in this case, it's, C15s, it's the next natural biggest impact step. So, supplements are great because people could use them. We have super savvy, customers who do the deep dive on the science, who listen to, your podcast and, are ready to learn or diving in. They have a lot of knowledge. They come back with really smart questions, which we greatly appreciate. And they're ready to come in and be like the early adopters, right? Yeah. And so supplementation is a great place to start. Really the global impact is going to be fortification of foods. And the nice thing about C15 as an ingredient is it's really stable. So a lot of times we think about fats and fatty acids like omega-3 and omega-6s. Those are oils. Those are just tough. Tough to, like, they get attacked by oxygen, so they go bad really fast. We happen to be gifted with C15, in which its whole role is a stabilizer. So it stabilizes our cells. A big part of that is because it's not an oil, right? It's a stable powder at room temperature. So that means it doesn't go bad. So this means it's just primed to be able to fortify foods in anywhere in the world and be a stable way to, get this nutrient, back into people's lives affordably. So that's really our next step, is how do we use this as part of a broad solution.
Is there a way for people to see where their C15 levels are at? Or, I mean, is that even possible now, or is it really just right now it takes pretty extensive work?
So it used to be where you needed to get a fatty acid panel, which isn't the end of the world, but it's not like any of us go to our doctors and they're like, oh, here's your fatty acid panel results.
And then I don't know if you saw, not everyone's, I don't know if anyone saw the South Park episode on the, it was the Ozempic episode, but like quote the song, the Navigating the American Healthcare System song that Butters was singing. It's amazing. And it just so I'm just saying like, okay, awesome. Here's me going to go get an essential fatty acid panel. It's going to take me 2 weeks of going to 4 different doctors and calling. Yeah. So
fits right along. Butters was right. And the fact that it's butter is kind of Butters. So now, so there are a lot of functional physicians and healthcare practitioners that have been using a fatty acid panel for maybe at least the last 5 years that has included C15. So we've talked to as we've been working with a lot of functional medicine practitioners, they're like, oh my gosh, wait, we've actually been collecting C15. We didn't know whether we should care about it. And as they're going back, Thomas, they're like writing us back and they're like, oh my gosh, we see like 12% of the people that, of our, patients that we've been looking at over the past 5 years, 12% are unquestionable. Like we're talking like 0.0 2% or 0.04 versus 0.2, right? And then another 12 to 14% being in this like less than 0.2 to 0.1%. And so they're like, no, this is real. We're like, well, yeah, it's definitely real. So the test has been available. What we're now doing is we've partnered with Genova Diagnostics to be able to have an at-home spot test for C15 so that people can get their C15 levels measured via Genova. So this is theirs, independent, but as we were making these discoveries, obviously the next natural question is, well, that's great, but how do I know what my C15 levels are? So now there's a way to be able to do that.
I'd be curious to test mine now. I was just in Europe for a month, and I think I like pretty much the only thing I ate was like drinking like 6 lattes a day and eating cheese and the occasional prosciutto, and that was like my diet for a month. So
yeah, I think you're probably in that 0.3, 0.4, 0.4, so not quite Sardinian, but getting close.
Do you actually see, is it something that builds up over time, or do you see a pretty rapid increase upon like increasing not only diet but also supplementation form of it?
Yeah, so in general, it takes, to safely get to understand where you're at. The nice thing that this test measures, it actually measures the amount of C15 in your red blood cell membranes. Yeah. So other tests might measure serum and plasma, which kind of gets to what you're saying. You might have the spike that goes up and down. It's less reliable. Like when you talk about glucose versus HbA1c, this would be the red blood cell membranes, like your HbA1c. So it's a more stable measurement, and it's stabilizing your cell membranes. So to actually get that measurement of your cell membranes is the most directly important. So it measures those levels that you're then able to work off of from there.
Interesting. Well, I will most importantly link out to the study down below, because I do know that, and I hope the viewers know that, the more eyeballs that get on a study, the better. Like, it's algorithmic, just like everything else in the world now. So, get eyeballs on the study, because this is one of those things where it's like people say, why isn't this front page news? It's like we focus on so many other things, and this is clear, legit science. This is not fringe, weird science, cherry picking, connect the dots BS. Like, this is real stuff, and it needs the eyeballs on it, and that's why I brought you here. And I know, yes, you have a supplement company with C15, and I'll link out to that down below, but that was not the purpose of this video. The purpose is like, let's get eyeballs on this study because people legitimately need to know this.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. We call ourselves a team of nerdy do-gooders, and our whole purpose is really to help improve global health. That was our job as a military family. It's our job, with this company. So thank you for helping to get the word out.
No, awesome. Thank you for coming, and thanks, Eric, for the workout this morning. All right. So as always, keep it locked into the channel. I'll link out to everything down below. And thank you.
Great. Thank you.